Good morning, South Africa, Africa, and everyone across the globe. Welcome to our 5th Tsietsi Mashinini Memorial Lecture. Today we present this lecture under the new normal, forced upon us by COVID-19. Our worlds and spaces are different now, yet we are so thrilled to be able to connect with you all to deliver this lecture. Let's take a moment to remember those who are infected and affected by this virus and the ones who've passed on. May we also bow our heads to remember the lives of all the women and children of this country who've lost their lives violently in the hands of their men. May all the departed souls rest in peace. May their brutal deaths not be in vain. May we as a nation raise our voices to fast-track action against the scourge of femicide. Our first speaker, Professor Shisana, will define for us what gender-based violence is, its causes, and what can we as a society do to eradicate or minimize it. She will also share insights on how we can make this a priority and a permanent agenda item in the state of our nation. Professor Shisana will provide us with her proposals on what communities and the society at large can do to achieve this. Prof. Olive Sishana holds a Doctor of Science degree from Johns Hopkins University. She's an honorary university professor at the University of Cape Town at the Psychiatry and Mental Department. She published various scientific papers in the areas of gender inequalities in relations to HIV, gender, and poverty. Professor Shisana is currently the Social Policy Special Advisor to President Cyril Ramaphosa, the position that includes advice on gender equality and gender-based violence. She was appointed to co-lead with civil society the Interim Steering Committee on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide that led in the development of the Emergency Response Action and the National Strategic Plan of Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. It is truly an honor to present to you today the Honorable Professor Olive Shisana to deliver the keynote address for us.
Of Justice and Constitutional Development, Mr. Ronald Lamola, the alumni of Morris Isaacson High School Administration, the Mashinini family, the Putanang Youth Trust, Program Director, ladies and gentlemen. It is both an honor and a privilege to be delivering this 5th annual Tsietsi Mashinini Memorial Lecture, named for a hero of the liberation struggle. In this month of June, 44 years ago, Tsietsi Mashinini was at the forefront of a great struggle waged by the students of Soweto, not just against an unjust system, but also as part of reclaiming their dignity. We honor this human rights leader less than a month after witnessing in broad daylight and on camera the disregard for Black life with the killing of George Floyd in the United States. His last words, "I can't breathe," fell on the deaf ears of a racist who looked calm as he kept his knee on Floyd's neck. In 2014, Eric Garner, another Black man, died at the hands of the police as he pleaded, "I can't breathe." Reverend Al Sharpton, at the memorial service of George Floyd, put his finger on the pulse when he said, "Get your knee off our necks." These words resonate with the legacy of Mashinini. He dedicated his life to getting our oppressors' knee off our necks. And for far too long, gender-based violence is a knee on our neck. I'm therefore extremely pleased that the organizers of this event chose gender-based violence as a theme for this year. Gender-based violence in South Africa is a significant problem, and it is on the rise. President Ramaphosa has rightly called it a shame and a stain on our national conscience. It is troubling that 26 years since the end of apartheid and the 1995 Beijing Women's Platform, that we still have to deal with this knee on our neck. What I hope to do in this lecture is to locate the phenomenon of gender-based violence within a global and domestic context, underline the factors fueling it, and chart a way forward to eradicate it. I have drawn on a substantial body of literature, including expert studies in the field and legislative instruments and others. This lecture is available in an academic paper format on the Gender-Based Violence website, www.gbvf.org.za. And I look forward to engaging with our viewers in the near future. So how grave is this problem? The answer is simple. It is very bad. Researchers estimate the levels of South African women who have experienced sexual and or physical intimate partner violence in their lifetime at 25 to 38%, with 31% taking place in their most recent marriage or cohabiting relationship. That was in 2015. The numbers are by now far higher, no doubt. We should express our concern for the high prevalence of violence against lesbians, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex persons, including the terrible practice of so-called corrective rape. The United Nations defines gender-based violence as physical, sexual, or psychological harm to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivations of liberty within public or private life. Within a global context, an estimated 30% of women aged 15 years and older who have had partners have experienced physical and or sexual intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. Regional rates range from 16.3% in East Asia to 65.6% in Sub-Saharan Africa. Gender-based violence is multifaceted. It includes battering, psychological abuse, marital rape, and femicide. It also includes sexual violence and harassment such as rape, unwanted sexual advances, child sexual abuse, and forced marriage. In South Africa, as elsewhere, sexual violence far too often results in femicide. As a nation, we recall with pain the women who have lost their lives after being sexually assaulted. We remember Anine Boysen, Precious Ramabulani, Uyinene Mrejane, Ntabiseng Rampai, and others, all young women in the prime of their lives who were brutalized in the most unimaginable manner. The overall rate of femicide is 9.5 times higher than the global average. There is widespread view that the criminal justice system is inadequate, and this leads women to fear that crime has somehow become normalized. To address gender-based violence, like with all problems, we have to get to the root of it. In South Africa, very specific historical factors are associated with gender-based violence, particularly at the family level. They warrant scrutiny. And here, the shadow of our past looms large. There was a migrant labor system that separated husbands and wives for 11 months in a year, breaking up families and resulting in men having wives and partners in both the rural and urban areas, causing conflict within families. There was influx control that made it impossible for rural Black women to stay in urban areas as part of the drive to prevent a permanent Black population living close to the white people. It is undeniable that this context of socio-economic and race inequality being perpetuated again and again has played no small role in driving sexual and gender-based violence. The culture of violence did not die when apartheid ended. It is being felt day after day on our streets, in our schools, and in our homes. The evidence report on the empowerment of women and girls draws on the notion of structural violence to demonstrate that gender, class, race, and sexuality were normatively constructed and enforced. It has been suggested that within these constructs, toxic interpretations of masculinity arise, and the linkages between toxic masculinity and gender-based violence are clear. No discussion around the gender-based violence would be complete without the critical examination of those behavioral aspects society expects men to display or achieve as a way of proving their manhood. This is manifested in cases where male control of women prevails, where male sexual entitlement is encouraged, where inequitable gender attitudes are normalized, and where the constant stereotyping of women in the media is not challenged. Let us consider the association between gender-based violence and more traditional or conservative norms, particularly the ones that are primarily patriarchal. Here we are talking about the persistent pigeonholing of the man as a provider, something that features in masculinity expressions worldwide, albeit practiced differently. Numerous studies have highlighted a prevailing view that when it comes to the man as a provider, that there should be a form of quid pro quo access to women's bodies. In a number of African countries, the sexuality of married women is understood to be in the realm of control of their husbands. For example, it has been observed in one study in Botswana that even a female who is a single parent is not allowed to have sexual relationships with any man other than the one with whom she has a child. However, a man is free to have a concubine or second wife if he pleases. The double standard relating to sex before marriage plays into patriarchy. Young women are discouraged or forbidden from having sexual intercourse before marriage, while there is no such constraint directed at young men. Certain cultures conduct virginity tests on young girls, yet there is no such testing for young men. Another traditional practice that disadvantages women is the practice of ukutwala, whereby a female is abducted for the purpose of marriage. While the practice can be conducted in an arranged manner, with all the parties aware of the date and time of the abduction, it can also happen in a way that the woman is ignorant of the arrangement. This in part fuels the practice of older men marrying younger girls, a practice we call age-disparate sexual relationships. Often the girl is too young to be married and has no right to consent. She may even end up having an early unplanned and unwanted pregnancy that comes with consequent reproductive health problems. Then there is the superiority of giving birth to male children. Girls are considered expendable commodities that will ultimately be married out to other families. And women with no sons constantly fear losing their marriages and homesteads to other women. The preference of the boy child is by no means a uniquely African phenomenon. It is also common in India and China, which creates an unbalanced sex ratio in favor of males. Within the evolutionary psychology framework, a higher male-to-female sex ratio brings about competition among males for female mates. This may lead to sexual frustration and jealousy among men, contributing to sexual violence. Not all men engage in gender-based violence. The question then is, why do some men commit gender-based violence and not others? There are studies suggesting there are specific factors causing some people to engage in violence. Experiencing or witnessing violence in childhood is thought to contribute to a person's probability of perpetrating violence themselves later in life. The link between the two is not always as concrete or as robust as it has been assumed. Another plausible explanation is a causal relationship between violence and substance abuse. The association between gender-based violence and substance abuse in South Africa is well documented. Studies connecting alcohol consumption and intimate partner violence indicate that 45% of men and 20% of women were drinking during or prior to such episodes. Of course, arguably, alcohol is just a catalyst of gender-based violence, and the intention was always there. That said, and notwithstanding, the causality is something we can no longer afford to ignore, to disregard, or to diminish. In 2006, in South Africa, 70% of domestic violence cases were alcohol-related, and a fifth of perpetrators arrested for rape indicated that they were under the influence of alcohol at the time of the crime. More recently, police records show that during the COVID-19 lockdown, with alcohol sales being prohibited, gender-based violence decreased substantially. We note, for example, that rape decreased by 84% and domestic violence by 70.7% during the same periods in 2019 and 2020. In addition, gender-based violence resulting from the power relations skewed in favor of men has long been acknowledged as a significant determining factor of women's HIV risk within sub-Saharan Africa and in South Africa in particular. Firstly, violence in intimate relationships directed at women is linked with money and women's HIV status, and is also linked with HIV being infected, having a higher incidence of violence than uninfected women. Secondly, there are studies that show South African women who were HIV negative at baseline were more likely to contract HIV if they experienced violence from a male partner as opposed to women who did not. This is a result of women disempowered to negotiate safe sex in relationships. The socio-economic factors at play also carry weight. Lack of a family and social support, low levels of education, and poor employment opportunities often prevent women from exiting abusive relationships, thus prolonging their risk of abuse. One 1994 study found that men tend to use physical violence against their wives if they have lower educational backgrounds and living in poverty. Furthermore, intimate partner violence is also associated with so-called compensatory masculinity, where men compensate for economic shortcomings and exert themselves through violence. I would like to turn now to the legal and regulatory context. In many countries around the world, the law both implicitly and explicitly fails to address gender-based violence. For example, approximately 127 countries do not criminalize rape within marriage. Another is the laws preventing women from working or running their own businesses. The 2018 Women Business and Law Indicators show that 104 economies continue to have laws that deny women the opportunity to work in specific jobs. 59 economies have no laws pertaining to sexual harassment within the workplace. And in 18 economies, husbands can lawfully prevent their wives from working. South Africa has implemented a range of comprehensive and progressive policies, laws, and support systems to protect women and advance their status. The Domestic Violence Act, the Employment Equity Act, the Sexual Offences Act, the Minimum Standards for Victims of Crime, the Service Charter, and the National Policy Statement for Victim Empowerment all are aimed at the elimination of gender-based violence. However, there is clearly a need for improvement, specifically with regard to improving women's economic prospects. South African women, particularly Black women, need support to overcome poverty, to access land and housing, to be considered when it comes to technology rollout and provision, to education and to employment. So then, compatriots, to borrow Lenin's famous call, what is to be done? Our success in combating the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the 2000s taught us the importance of having one national plan and a coordinated implementation strategy. It taught us about forging collaboration and consensus, and about building the social compacts, which President Ramaphosa has spoken of at length. 2019 marked a turning point in the country's response to gender-based violence. Civil society comprised of a cross-section of women from Total Shutdown, African National Congress, and other organizations took to the streets, expressing their frustration with the growing atrocities that are committed against women. The Total Shutdown women went to the Union building and were met with a receptive president. The acknowledgement by President Ramaphosa that the government's response to gender-based violence was indeed inadequate, and his willingness to champion the cause opened a window of opportunity to craft a new strategy. From then on, government and civil society began to work together towards a common goal of ending gender-based violence. The partnership between government, civil society, and the development partners in South Africa led to the formulation of the Gender-Based Violence Emergency Response Action Plan in mid-2019. It was followed this year by the government's approval of the National Strategic Plan to combat gender-based violence. The plan comprised of the following interventions. First is access to justice for victims and survivors. Second is change norms and behavior through high-level prevention efforts. Third is respond to victims and survivors of gender-based violence. Fourth is strengthen accountability and architecture to respond to the scourge of gender-based violence adequately. And finally is to prioritize interventions that facilitate economic opportunities for addressing women's economic vulnerability. We are still in the early days, and the National Strategic Plan was only released in April. The population-based survey on gender-based violence that will be undertaken soon will provide critical information on, firstly, the extent of the problem nationally, provincially, and locally. Secondly, the drivers of gender-based violence. And lastly, but most importantly, the needs of women and girls. This will enable us to ensure budgets are based on the needs identified by the survey. It is crucial to have credible and reliable data to ensure monitoring and evaluation. We are determined to effect change at a societal level, and that is why there will be programs in schools, in workplaces, religious institutions, as well as households. We are also determined to be focused. Key will be interventions that prioritize challenging toxic masculinities and exploring alternative methods of expressing manliness. This is also an opportunity to engage with sexual orientation and gender identity issues as other vital factors driving specific forms of gender-based violence, as well as developing interventions for the protection of children. In tandem with all of these things, we have to address the specific themes highlighted in the 2016 White Paper on Safety and Security on strengthening the criminal justice system, early intervention to prevent violence and crime, victim support, safety through effective and integrated service delivery, and active public and community participation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that we have a long way to go to end gender-based violence. Our success rests on state and society working together in a collaborative manner, implementing evidence-based interventions. To be effective, we must learn continuously from emerging strategies and practices from those working on the ground as gender-based violence continues to mutate into different forms. In doing so, we'll have to remain cognizant of the need to factor the financial economic inclusion of women into our planning, because this is key to women's independence and agency. Our country is privileged to have the political will at the highest level from our president, our cabinet, and our government leaders. As we commemorate Tsietsi Mashinini's legacy, let us march forward to end gender-based violence, inspired by the words of Reverend Al Sharpton. To the perpetrators of gender-based violence, we say, take your knee off our necks. We must march forward, heeding the wise words of Tsietsi Mashinini, who at the age of 19 implored the students as they were to embark on the heroic march of 1976. Stay disciplined, no violence. I thank you.
You don't own me. You don't own me. You don't own me. So get your hands off of me. Why? Why can't I be free to be me? Like you, free to live my life as I please. Why can't I be free to live my life without the fear of landing in a body bag? Answer me this. Will I then be free if I cut out my womb? Slap, kick, fist, another one down. Mission accomplished. Go ahead and celebrate as their blood seeps into the ground. You do this to your sisters, daughters, and wives. So answer me this. Will we be free if we cut out our wombs? Are you so damaged that you tear apart the one that gives life, so hurt that you refuse to learn to love? When will enough is enough be clear enough, plain to see that you are destroying us? You build us up with words of love and tear us down. You strip us away of our self-worth, destroy our peace, and steal our innocence. Now tell me, man, when will you stop being the devil's accomplice? Now listen to me clearly. You don't own me. You don't own her. And matter of fact, you don't own us. So get your hands off of us.
I am indeed truly honored to talk today about the use of art as a tool of healing and liberation. How women in South Africa have used art making to break the silence and to find their own voice in the struggle against gender violence, against patriarchy and repression. And how this art making has become a way to communicate with each other, to mobilize, and eventually to build a struggle which will change this pandemic of violence and repression against women. This art-making process that I'm going to talk about builds directly upon the art of the liberation struggle. It comes from ideas developed by cultural groups in the 70s and 80s in the fight against apartheid oppression. It's an approach to culture which has fed and merged with art and ideas developed in the struggle for women's liberation around the world. This art making begins with looking at our own experiences, our awareness and understanding of what happens to us as women and to the women living around us in our communities, where we have been and are under fire every day and every night. The particular process we use today began with a series of workshops for women run by an organization called the Curricular Development Project. In these workshops, women living in the Joburg area began to draw images about their lives as a group. They talked about these pictures, and they focused on the problems that we as women face and on what we need to do to address these problems. Over the next 15 years, we ran workshops with women from different backgrounds, with different experiences, and in different areas. And we saw over and over again how ingrained this use of gender-based violence has been to keep women silent and repressed in our society. Gender-based violence appears in our history. It appears in our daily behavior. It even appears in the very structures which we have created to protect and defend all of us as human beings equally in this world.
Ngo-1990 kwafika into eyayibuhlungu kakhulu kwaliwa apha eRhawutini. Apha ngamasoja siyabaleka, nali apha lidubula abanye, bayabaleka abanye apha.
Over time, women from these workshops have run new projects with more women, and so this has become a movement in itself. The outpouring of women's stories and the energy and the ideas in the organization that have come out of these workshops has been overwhelming and amazing. Yes, we knew in theory, and we knew in our own practical experience in our lives, that gender violence is a reality for all of us. But when women gain the space to talk about what has happened to them and what is still happening to them every day of their lives. It is clear that this violence is not solely isolated pain or personal tragedy, although it is obviously that, but it's something that we have to confront as a community and as a nation. And we see the importance of organizing ourselves as women, as the women at the coalface of gender-based violence, to fix this massive fault in our new society. In conclusion, look at this powerful mural painted in Everton last year by the women's group Sasunga Baninga and with the 1 in 9 campaign. This mural speaks out. It says loudly and clearly and uncompromisingly words that all of us need to hear, all of us in our nation, our communities, our society. We need to hear this message today. Thank you.
Thank you, Katlego, for that beautiful, moving poem that you've just delivered for us. And thank you to Judy Zainman for her artwork. We really appreciate all of your work. You really also made us to reflect on the issues that affect women. Our second speaker is Ronald Lamola, the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. Minister Lamola will review how far the aspirations of the youth of 1976 have been realized in addressing inequality and racism, with emphasis on the role of the state in fighting gender-based violence today. Minister will set out the role of the justice system in preventing and eradicating gender-based abuse of women in South Africa, and what can we, the public, do to complement their efforts. He is the former Deputy President of the ANC Youth League. He sits in two of its most powerful structures, the NEC and the National Working Committee. Minister Lamola holds LLB from University of Venda, a practical legal training from University of South Africa. He has a postgraduate certificate in corporate law from UNISA. He also holds a postgraduate certificate in banking law and the financial markets. He also has LLM in corporate law from the University of Pretoria. I'm honored to introduce you to our Honorable Minister, Ronald Lamola. Minister, over to you.
Mashinini family, the alumni of Morris Isaacson High School, Morris Isaacson High School Administration, Putanang Youth Trust, Professor Olive Shisana, fellow South Africans. It is with a deep sense of honor that I'm able to speak on the legacy of this incredible South African, Tsietsi Mashinini, on the invite of the Morris Isaacson alumni. I'm truly honored to speak about such a great giant of our struggle. At the time of the 1976 uprising, Mashinini was the SRC president in his high school, Morris Isaacson High School in Soweto. After the uprising, it became apparent that the only means of survival was for him to flee the country due to the constant danger from the apartheid security forces he was confronted with. So he went into exile where his name was already lodged in history. This is evident by how he was received by continental luminaries like President of Guinea, Secretary, and our very own Miriam Makeba, amongst others. I must confess that there is a statement which I read in a media interview that Mashinini conducted on 15 November 1976, which has always moved me. In this interview, Mashinini says, "We were getting sick and tired because instead of oppression being gradually removed from us, the system was in fact implementing some of the thoughts of oppressing us. I realized that people were fed up with this sort of thing, but nobody had the guts to start anything. I decided that if we were to demonstrate, it will have an effect because there was never a demonstration before in Soweto. The rest is history. As the students' protest in Soweto galvanized efforts against oppression that black people enjoyed under the apartheid regime. The generation of Mashinini led a protest that shook the apartheid regime and resulted in more countries becoming in solidarity with efforts for a free and a democratic South Africa. This is what Mashinini envisaged when he expressed a view that he was sick and tired of a system that was oppressing the people. Mashinini was far ahead of his time, as he spoke of the type of education given to a black child was meant to make a black children employees of the white man and not to play a role in the mainstream of the economy, like in technical skills such as engineering, architecture, accountancy, and so on. This is the type of education that has to date systematically excluded black professionals in the mainstream of the economy. It is a legacy of apartheid we must uproot in our corporate culture. Black professional skills matter. This is the same systematic exclusion meted against women through patriarchy. It is not difficult to imagine that this is exactly what women in our communities feel today. Women are sick and tired because of patriarchy, which is only gradually removed in our society today. Men are constantly implementing a special type of oppression. What will it take for us as men to realize that this sort of thing has no place in our communities? You do not need any law to truly believe that women are humans and treat them like humans. Because of us men, women do not feel safe anywhere in this country. Their fears are informed by heinous and fatal deeds they suffer at the hands of men. As men, we must stand up, say enough is enough and not in our name. Tsegofatso Pule, a young woman, joins a list of women in our country who have died allegedly at the hands of men. The list cannot grow any longer. Our commitment as men to the performance of our masculinity will render us becoming oppressors. Our commitment to violence will only lead to more bloodshed. In South Africa, a lot of blood was shed for our liberation. It was women in particular who enjoyed harsher elements of the oppressive regime. It is the ultimate betrayal of our liberation struggle that even in a democratic society, women weep with even greater sorrow. We often look at the achievements of the democratic society to understand where we are as a country. But we should also say what the biggest threat to our democracy is. It is our commitment as men to violence. It seems violence is a constant feature in our communities. We have seen allegations leveled against law enforcement agencies in the case of Collins Khosa, and there were many others before him. The matter must be investigated expeditiously for the family and society to find closure and for the law to take its course. To the young people of today, you are greatly indebted to the bravery of Mashinini in confronting the tyranny of apartheid. His commitment to the cause of total emancipation of black learners was a noble deed that all of us should emulate as we address today's challenges, besieging young people such as unemployment, poverty, exclusion at institutions of higher learning, and discrimination at the workplace. Youth Day in South Africa is the application of historical lens, which is a particular type of consciousness which weighed on Mashinini and his generation. As a result, it culminated in a necessary revolutionary confrontation with the political and economic system of the day. This consciousness still lives with us today. Indeed, it is the tradition that continues to weigh on us who remain. In line with this consciousness, we must be able to reject the racist law enforcement within our borders and beyond. The numerous list of people which George Floyd joins, whom were killed by people who were supposed to protect them, called for the highest form of solidarity. This consciousness, for me, manifests itself in the form of a question which I will pose to you today as well. There is no doubt that the society which Mashinini imagined is under construction, but the question is how much progress have we made in material terms? After 26 years of democratic rule, the systematic and/or structural impact of racism is vivid for all of us to see. It is for this reason that we simply cannot afford to be corrupt. If we are to give effect to the likes of Mashinini's vision, we must be willing to confront the legacy of colonialism, no matter the cost. Our practice of non-racialism should have a structural effect on our communities. Addressing racism should have a structural impact on the economy. Black South Africans should be integrated into the mainstream of the economy. We should not be apologetic to integrate black professionals into the mainstream of the economy, and black professionals should feel that their skills matter in the South African economy. As we recall, the 1976 generation had set their sight on the most critical element of our country's future, the education system. They had sights on education system which sought to domesticate black people so that they may become a better tool for the white man once they reach the workplace. An education system which subconsciously made African indigenous people inferior. One simple has to walk through the huge walls of correctional facilities to understand that if you are an African male in South Africa, the chances of you interacting with the criminal justice system from within a correctional facility are extremely high. Criminal justice, right at its core, needs to be about the people in our communities. Young people in our society should be the guardians of safety for our communities, not the perpetrators of crime. The rehabilitation and re-education the Freedom Charter speaks of needs to be reserved for those who have failed to decolonize through our education system. To this end, we must reorientate our criminal justice system. Women must have faith in it. Victims must see themselves at the center. Justice must be tangible. In this administration, we will be redefining a lot of these tenets of our criminal justice system. The first wave of these reforms have begun through our sexual offenses prosecution, which limits secondary victimization. This, along with strengthening the Domestic Violence Act, recalibrating the sexual offenses list, and addressing the bail provision for sexual offenses, will begin to help many in our society. We will strengthen the Thuthuzela care centers to ensure cooperation between government and civil society. Of immediate and particular significance is the increased cooperation between the South African Police Service and the Department of Justice. The services which one can obtain from the Thuthuzela care centers are critical. These include a direct pipeline to prosecution and immediate reception of medical care for screening, test, and treatment of survivors of rape, crimes, as well as professional and empathic counseling. South African women cannot breathe because of our needs as men, be it a knee of their brothers, uncles, intimate partners. As we fondly remember Mashinini, we need to transform our minds. We must become sick and tired of challenges besieging our communities. None but ourselves can be our liberators. We must be awake to the possibilities that we can take advantage to ensure that the struggles of Mashinini and others were not in vain. We must challenge the status quo. It cannot be correct that 26 years into democracy, our people are still victims of some of the things Mashinini and his generation fought against. We must partner with government and take responsibility for our individual actions, as government alone will not be able to tackle all the challenges of our country. The advent of COVID-19 requires all of us, in whatever corner we find ourselves in, to take responsibility, to practice social distancing, to learn to live a new normal. In that way, we will have done justice to the legacy of Mashinini, who was a committed activist for change and was ready to adapt anew. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, one of the greatest liabilities of history is that all too many people fail to remain awake through great periods of social change. Every society has its protectors of status quo and its fraternities of the indifferent who are notorious for sleeping through revolutions. Today, our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant, and to face the challenges of change. Amandla.
Tsietsi Mashinini left us with an enduring legacy, and we thank our speakers for further illuminating that legacy. He fought and won against a powerful enemy, not by carrying a gun, but by organizing young people at grassroots level, and with a singularity of purpose, shook the foundations of a racially oppressive regime. Professor Shisana, the Morris Isaacson alumni thanks you for your wisdom and enlightenment as we fight an enemy that does not see color, wealth, status, or education, but the deadliest of all others, as it targets one facet of our inherent being, gender. In the spirit of our June 16 patron, we take this clarion call to continue the fight against gender-based violence. Honorable Minister Lamola, our hopes and aspirations towards defeating this monster lies with you and your colleagues as our first line of defense. As a young person yourself, we thank you for representing our young people and implore you and your colleagues in the cabinet to enhance your efforts towards ending this scourge being waged against our women folk. I thank you.
All right, that's the Tsietsi Mashinini lecture there. Now, 7 suspects allegedly at the center of the collapse of the VB